In this lecture, we're going to cover Chapter 4, which is Demanding Ethical and Socially Responsible Behavior. I think for this lecture, it's fitting that we take a look at the skyline of Singapore, which is one of the least corrupt and most ethical nations in the world. First, let's take a look at what is the definition of ethics. Ethics are society's accepted standards of moral behavior. And I think you all are used to this by now, but there's a flag next to that. It means it's particularly important for the exam. Also particularly important, I want you to understand that Americans, I think because we have so many different cultures and so many different backgrounds ethnically, that we actually have very few moral absolutes. And the authors of your text point out that we often decide situationally if it's okay to lie, cheat, steal, or on a more personal level, to drink and drive. Americans also have a very strong sense of individualism. We have a belief that everyone needs to do what's best for him or herself. And this kind of individualism and situational ethics is a focus of the legal briefcase on page 91, which gives some great summaries of recent big scandals. Now, looking at the wider perspective, integrity, respect for human life, self-control, honesty, courage, and self-sacrifice are common among all the world's major religions, as is some version of the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Ethics begins with us. And there's a few questions that the text points out that you can use to guide your ethical decisions, and each of these has a flag because it is important for you to know these three questions right off the bat. The first one is my proposed action legal? It's kind of the litmus test for guiding your ethical decisions, and it's where you should start. Is it legal? The second question you should ask is it balanced? In other words, would you want to be treated the way that you're proposing this deal? An ethical business person's goal should always be a win-win situation. Because if you propose a win-lose situation, that kind of creates resentment and could possibly lead to retaliation, which is not really a very favorable thing to have in a business environment. And last, you should ask, how will this decision make me feel about myself? In other words, will you have to hide your actions? An ethical business person will do what is right and ethical as well as what is profitable. The text outlines 6 major steps in establishing business ethics. I have flagged 3 of them as particularly important. Starting with number 1, top management must adopt and unconditionally support a corporate code of conduct. In other words, it has to start at the top. Ethics in a company has to start at the top. And that's kind of what number 2 is saying. Employees must understand that the expectations begin at the top, but also that employees are expected to act accordingly. The third step is that managers and others should be trained to consider the ethical implications of business decisions. A fourth very important step to establishing ethical codes of business is that employees must be able to communicate anonymously. That is, they have to be able to whistleblow without the feeling of that there's going to be some pushback or some consequences for their action. If you don't provide on number 4 an area or an ability for your employees to communicate anonymously, they will still communicate. But most likely who they'll communicate with is not the company, but the media. And that's a pretty undesirable situation. So I think that number 4 is just really important as far as, if an employee observes something going on inside the company that's not ethical, there needs to be a forum and an ability for that employee to bring that to the management's attention. Okay. Number 5 is one that is flagged. Outsiders must be informed of the company's ethics program. This is very important because a lot of the pressures that businesses face regarding ethical decisions come from pressures from suppliers. And so it's very important that a business establish an ethical code, but also clearly communicate that code with the suppliers. And lastly, also a flagged one, is that the ethics code must be enforced and speedy action taken if it is violated. It's not acceptable to backburner or to downplay a violation of a company's ethical code, because it really undermines the whole reason of having an ethical code in the first place. There are 2 types of corporate ethical codes, and this figure is adapted from figure 4.3, which is on page 97 in your text. And it's extremely important for your upcoming exam. So pay close attention and take a lot of notes here. There's 2 types of corporate ethical codes. You've got a compliance-based system, and we'll cover that one first. The ideal in a compliance-based system is to conform to outside standards. In other words, laws, basically. The objective is to avoid criminal misconduct by breaking a law. The leaders in a compliance-based system are lawyers. And the methods for building a compliance-based ethical code is education, reduced employee discretion. In other words, you're going to impose more rules on them because you want there to be less leeway for an employee to do something wrong. And so you'll create very rigid standard operating procedures that literally boil down to if this, then that. Okay, and those amount to controls, the controls that are placed on people, and there's penalties for when people violate the ethical, really the legal code. So compliance-based essentially is looking at the legal aspects and not much deeper than that. On the other hand, an integrity-based ethical system is one that conforms to outside standards, so laws, and also some chosen internal ones. So it goes above just purely prescribed, to the letter of the law, and it extends that by saying, and in addition, it might not be technically illegal, but this is how we are going to conduct our business, and that's that. I mean, it's not that it's illegal, but we're just not going to do it. In an integrity-based system, the objective is to enable responsible employee conduct. And the leaders in an integrity-based system are managers with the aid of lawyers and others. So you still have lawyers, because at the bottom of everything, ethics is, after all, it's guided by law, because that's how our society works. So there are legal pieces underneath of everything. But in an integrity-based system, because you've got those chosen internal standards as well, you're going to lead with managers. The methods on an integrity-based ethical code are education, leadership starting from the top down, accountability at all levels of the organization, and decision processes that give employees the ability to use their discretion to handle a situation the way a company would like them to handle it. And at the bottom of an integrity-based system, there are still controls and there are still penalties. Because, after all, we are talking about a foundation of law. So, integrity-based systems are still dealing with law, but they add some additional components on top of that. Let me give you an example. And these are important because you'll need to know examples of these systems for the exam. An example of a compliance-based ethical code would read something like, anyone caught breaking the law will be fired. It's compliance-based because it emphasizes the prevention of unlawful behavior and the penalization of somebody who does violate that. And it clearly spells out that the person would be fired. An integrity-based ethical code, on the other hand, goes a little bit deeper than that. And I have an example that I can give you of an integrity-based ethical operation. For a long time, I sold inkjet printers, and this was years ago, but it's very pertinent example. Inkjet printers. I sold inkjet printers for the Epson Corporation. Occasionally, I would talk to a customer and I would hear the needs of that customer, and I didn't really have a product that fit exactly to what they needed. And rather than me try to boost my bottom line by just telling them what they wanted to hear and selling them one of my products anyway, I might have turned them over to another representative from another competitive company to let that person make a sale. And that's an example of applying an integrity-based ethical decision process. Another example would be like this. Let's say that you went to meet with an academic counselor, and when you started describing your goals for your education, the academic counselor actually realized that TCC maybe wasn't the best fit for you, but there was another institution that maybe specialized in the field that you were looking to get into, or just overall would just fit you better for whatever reason. An integrity-based ethical approach would be for that counselor to actually advise you to go to that other institution that was a better fit. So there's two examples. We spent quite a bit of time talking about these different ethical codes because you'll need to know them inside and out with examples for the exam. Next, we'll look at corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is when corporations are doing good for society and not just the owners. And there's a flag there. The book points out that there might be some question about, is social responsibility stealing wealth from investors? In some ways it sort of is, because the business is taking profits and giving them away, basically, or it's doing other things with those profits that are not increasing the wealth of the investors. And so on a short term, the answer to that question may be yes, that it's stealing wealth from investors. In the long term, though, and we'll see this in a couple bullet points, in the long term, the answer is no, because it creates a stronger company that people want to do business with. And so you end up doing more business because you're socially responsible. Other critics point out that when you have corporate responsibility or social responsibility, you're almost moving towards socialism, because the businesses are kind of financing society's good. But the book also points out that some businesses take the stance of, well, we kind of owe the communities in which we serve. And with all of the scandal and mistrust for management and businesses in general these days, the trend is toward businesses feeling like they owe their communities because they need to establish a strong, socially responsible image. Research shows that companies with good social reputations attract better employees, they draw more customers, and they enjoy greater employee loyalty. So if you're attracting better employees, you're drawing more customers. That probably will translate to more sales, which is going to help the investors. So there's where we say, in the short term, you're stealing the wealth from the investors. In the long term, you're building a stronger business. And that is better for the investors. Also, you'll enjoy greater employee loyalty. There's a lot to be said for that. Less turnover means you have to do less training. And it just means your business operates more effectively and more efficiently. So, it's just all around. It's a good thing. I mean, think about this. You want to do business with companies that you think are doing a good thing. Social responsibility takes on several dimensions. First, it can be corporate philanthropy. And the studio that I talk about, that I run for pets, that's what I do. At the conclusion of each of my events has a beneficiary, a rescue beneficiary, and at the end of the event, I cut a check in cash to a rescue group. That's corporate philanthropy. Social initiatives, they kind of relate to the industry that a business is in. And the book gives the example of Molson Coors, which is a brewery company, right? They brew Coors beer. They probably have other things, Molson beer as well, and they probably brew other beverages as well. But they have the beer as their biggest thing, right? So as they have a social responsibility, they have a social initiative in a program called the Taxi Guy program, which gives people a ride home if they've had too much to drink. And so it's related to the business that they're in. Next is corporate responsibility. Corporate responsibility, it could mean things like hiring minority workers, minimalizing pollution, generally making safe products. And then last is this corporate policy. And corporate policy is when a business takes a stance on an issue. And the book points out that Patagonia, which is a manufacturer of rough and rugged outdoor equipment, and their corporate policy on social responsibility reads like this: a love of wild and beautiful places demands participation in the fight to save them and to help reverse the steep decline in the overall environmental health of our planet. We donate our time, services, and at least 1% of our sales to hundreds of grassroots environmental groups all over the world who help reverse the tide. So what Patagonia is saying there is that they're committed to preserving the outdoor places that their customers love. And they donate money. Their employees donate their time. And that they are deeply committed to helping that. And so that's kind of a corporate policy stance. Now, something else that I have flagged on here is a question. How is social responsibility different from ethics? Think about this for just a second. Ethics is kind of like the law. And doing things that are right by society's standards. Social responsibility, on the other hand, is kind of about a business going above and beyond. That it's about giving back to the communities in which these businesses operate. And so that's how social responsibility is different than just pure ethics. Ethics is about the decisions that a business makes and that they conform to society's standards of right and wrong and that they're legal. Social responsibility is about a business doing good for society, not just its owners. Businesses have ethical responsibility to their customers. The book points out JFK outlined 4 basic rights of consumers. First, a right to safety. Consumers deserve to have products, to use products from our company that are safe. One thing that comes to mind is all the recalls. Think about all the product recalls that are out there, and all the pet food recalls in particular. That first came to my mind when I thought about that. It's safe to feed your pet this particular food or that particular food, and so that is safety. Customers also have the right to be informed. In other words, how about honesty in labeling? That would lead to an informed consumer. Number 3, consumers have the right to choose. Yes, consumers have the right to be free from coercion. And number 4, the right to be heard. That means that when a customer complains, that complaint is received and addressed. The Better Business Bureau is an organization that really exists primarily to enforce the number 4 piece. And someday I'll get my business registered with the BBB. It does cost some money to do that. I think it's about like $270, I think, to get the accreditation. So for my small business, it's kind of a large expense at this point. But my goal is to one day have it registered with that so that customers have a sense of mind, that a peace of mind, that if they complain, that somebody's going to hear it, because the complaints are arbitrated by a third party. So they have to be answered. And so that gives consumers a peace of mind. So anyway, that's the right to be heard. And the payoff for a business being ethically responsible to its customers is huge. The payoff is a whole new group of customers who admire the company for its social efforts. I go back to my studio as an example, and the payoff for me has been extremely good for all the rescue work that I do and the donations that I make. Word's gotten around, and people really respect the work that I do for rescue, and as a result, my events have gotten extremely busy. And so that's a great thing for business. And that can just bring in all those extra customers that just help make the company that much more successful. And speaking of successful companies, the people that makes really happy are the investors, because the more successful the company is, the wealthier the investors get. So going back a couple slides ago and looking at that question of, does social responsibility, does it subtract from the bottom line? Well, in the short term, but in the long term, it does not subtract from the bottom line. It adds to it. Because by doing good, and I put in parentheses there, ethically, you can do well, in parentheses, profitably, for reasons that we've talked about already. There are some particular issues with ethical responsibility relating to investors, and one of them is insider trading, which works like this, especially if a company has stock. When news breaks about stock, things happen. Stock prices go up, they go down, depending on the news. Once the the world market hears certain pieces of news, the stock price will soar, or it may tumble. There's a wonderful example in the book about IBM, who really did something very just innocent. They were acquiring a company, and Lotus. Okay, they were acquiring the Lotus company, and one of the managers told it was an IBM secretary who told her husband, who then turned around and told a couple coworkers, who then turned around and told a pizza delivery guy, and in the space of about 6 hours, 25 people made $468,000 because they made some quick decisions to invest in Lotus stock. And once the news broke that IBM was acquiring Lotus Corporation, the Lotus stock soared through the roof. And so there was an example of where somebody, really pretty innocently, disclosed some information that led to insider trading, and the next thing you know, it created a lot of wealth for people. Now, fair disclosure says you disclose the info to everybody or nobody. But even still, insider trading is very hard to avoid because the temptation is so great to act on news that you know and nobody else does. Next, businesses also have an ethical responsibility to their employees. Companies should reward hard work and talent. They should treat employees with respect, and in return, the employees will respect the company as well. There's a book that they talk about in the text, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to. I ordered the second edition, which is going to be out in June of 2012, so I've got that one on pre-order at Amazon. I'm going to read that one. And the book is Contented Cows Give Better Milk. The book, in parentheses here, is not really about cows. Okay, it's about companies. It's about companies who treated their employees ethically and responsibly, and then the companies who just, employees were objects. Okay, the ones that treated their employees ethically and with respect were called the contented cow companies. And those contented cow companies, over a 10-year period, outgrew their competitors 4-1. The contented cow companies out-earned the common cow companies. That was what the employees are objects companies were called. Okay, the contented cow companies out-earned the common cow companies by $40 billion in a 10-year period. They also created 800,000 more jobs. And what this really goes back to is just this whole aura effect. If you're treating your employees with respect and treating them ethically, they're going to be happy. Happy employees are going to make better products. Better products are going to make customers happier. And when customers are happier, you do better. It's kind of like this huge continuum. Do you see how all these things kind of interrelate to one another? But the employee piece is critical because the employees are the ones that make the business happen. Businesses also have an ethical responsibility to society and the environment. And we talked, about the society piece being, philanthropy and those different pieces, but it goes beyond charity. The responsibility to the environment is deeper rooted than that. And you'll hear me say the word a lot this semester, sustainability. It really is huge, and it's shaping the future of businesses in America. We're no longer happy to just continue exploiting resources. We need, as businesses, to provide some sort of plan for the future. And it's created this green movement, which has led to these green collar jobs. You've probably heard of white collar jobs. Those are the managers. The blue collar jobs are kind of the worker bees. And then the green collar jobs, these are the people who are a whole new sector that has developed, whose job is to monitor how the company is behaving relative to sustainability and the environment. There's an example that I can give relating to biofuel or biodiesel between Brazil and America. And this is where a regulatory difference, which, if you recall, goes back, is a compliance-based ethics piece. In the U.S., the compliance-based law that biodiesel manufacturers have to contend with is that the fuel waste products must be disposed of in a prescribed manner. Those same regulations are not present for the Brazilian firms, and so the U.S. firms have to account for those extra regulations and post-processing of waste products that the Brazilian firms don't, and therefore the U.S. firms add the cost of processing the waste products from biodiesel into the final cost of their biodiesel. So U.S. biodiesel costs a lot more than Brazilian. But it's because of the difference in ethical responsibility to the environment that's being regulated in the U.S. I think over time, all businesses are going to succumb to consumer pressures, though, because even in Brazil, where it's not regulated, I think eventually they're going to realize that it may raise costs, but we only have one world. While we're on the topic of Brazil versus U.S. and one world, let's take a look at, in conclusion, let's look at international ethics. On the international scene, every one of you would be surprised at just how common influence peddling is and bribery. Influence peddling is needing to give, say, 10,000 US dollars to a very high-ranking government official in a particular country in order to expedite the processing of your particular request to build a plant or to form a partnership with a company. And it can be very tempting to make those kinds of payments, because if you really want that partnership, or if you really want that expansion, then there really is no other way other than making those payments. And so that's a big challenge when it comes to international ethics. Now here is an example of where U.S. companies can demand social responsibility from suppliers. On the right-hand side there is a picture of a garment factory that manufactured textiles for the Target Corporation. I visited that factory in Cambodia with my business class from William & Mary, and it was a very interesting, eye-opening experience, and a perfect lesson in how a U.S. company is demanding social responsibility from its suppliers, because Target Corporation had a list, like an employee bill of rights almost, for the people that worked in that factory. And it outlined things like the conditions and the lighting and the temperature, which I will point out was about 89 degrees in there. The regulation said that the temperature could not go above 90, and it was about 89, and it was in December, so that's the winter time. But for us, that's pretty hot, but for them, that's really almost like air conditioning, because they're used to about 110 in the shade. And if you notice how many of them are wearing long sleeve shirts or are wearing more than one shirt, because to them it's cold right now. I mean, it's December and even though it's 89 degrees, they're putting on a coat. And so it was hot to us, but it was not hot to them. But I'm just saying, Target regulated it by saying the temperature in here can never go above, and their thing was 90 degrees. So the conditions in there were good for the workers. The lighting was awesome. The place was so clean you could eat off the floor. The employees had ample amount of workspace, and they were given breaks and that kind of thing. But there's an example of where a U.S. company is imposing social responsibility on the supplier. Remember that we covered earlier that when companies are establishing their ethical codes, that one of the things they need to do is communicate to the external suppliers, because that's where you often get a lot of pressure and to look the other way. And in the case of manufacturing, that is certainly the case. But here's an example of where Target is saying, if you supply for us, you're going to meet these requirements. And the last point that I'm going to talk about is child labor. And I have a bullet there that says tough. It's a tough ethical question. And you know, it really, really is for me. And I wonder how you all feel about this. Of course, you're in the situation I was a couple of years ago before I had experienced this, especially throughout Asia, where the people are paid so poorly. But yet, the cost of living, they can't sustain themselves on their salary alone. And so if they have 3 kids, putting those kids to work means the difference between a family living in just total abject poverty and being able to get along. In Cambodia, for example, they have half days of school so that families can let their children work. And it's designed that way on purpose. And so having seen those places in the world where families absolutely need the income of their children just to get by, I'm really on the fence about it with child labor. What do you all think?